Chapter 28. Dani stepped out onto the back deck of Zach's cabin and looked around. She needed something to distract her from the flip-flops her stomach was doing. The deck was neat, much as it had been the last time she'd been out here when they'd gone out on the boat. The only thing that had changed was the stack of life vests was missing from the table. The scent of pine drifted on the breeze that brushed across her skin. "Have a seat," Zach invited. Dani looked around and went to one of a pair of Adirondack chairs that faced the lake. Normally the low, laid-back seating wasn't her favorite, but it would do for now. She sat and remained silent. She didn't want to have to do this, but she knew that to refuse would be childish. She was trying to make a better life for her and Mark, and as much as she hated it, this was what it would take. Listening to Zach, the man she'd never stopped loving, after last night she could admit it, if only to herself, tell her about sleeping with other women. Especially Marcy. Zach sat beside her. He sighed. Dani wondered if maybe this was as difficult for him as it was for her. "I'm not sure where to start," Zach said. "How about the part where you fucked my high school enemy?" Dani tried to keep the venom she felt from her voice, but knew she didn't quite manage. "We can start there if you want." His voice went soft and she knew she'd hurt his feelings, but she couldn't bring herself to care now. He'd fucked her enemy. "Yes. I slept with Marcy. But that's all it was. Sex." He paused a moment. She wasn't sure if he was waiting for her to say something or not, but she wasn't ready to say anything. She was still seething with anger and hurt. "We've done it off and on for the last 4 or 5 years. When neither of us was seeing anyone and we had a need, we'd get together. I did meet with her a couple weeks ago. The day I saw you in the coffee shop. I told her it was over. I was done." He turned away a moment then turned back. "Even if things don't work the way I'd like with you, I won't go back to her." "Is that all?" "No. But that's where you wanted to start. That's all about her." "What else do I need to know?" She knew there had to be more. There was always more, and she didn't know if she could hear more about Marcy right now. "When you moved away, I was hurt. I knew it wasn't your fault, but that didn't keep it from being painful." He stared at his lap where his hands lay folded together. "Please don't think I'm blaming anyone, I'm trying to explain. Anyway, when you dumped me." He held up one hand as she started to speak. "I know now that you didn't, but that's what it was then. You dumping me, with no word as to why, was my reality and it hurt. I was devastated." Dani's chest ached as she remembered how she'd felt when she thought about the same time in her life. The new kid in school about to become known as the pregnant girl, abandoned by the baby's father. She'd been so absorbed in the now that she hadn't thought about what he'd felt when he'd thought she'd left him. "I don't know if you knew, but I was planning to go see you." He took a couple breaths. "I had already bought a ring and was planning to propose." Her breath caught in her chest. The world seemed to spin. Dani was glad she was sitting. She'd had no clue. Tears pooled in her eyes. She looked away and blinked them away before Zach could see them. She knew without having to think about it that if he had asked her to marry him then, she would have said yes, even without her pregnancy. She would have for a long time. Now, not as much because she had to consider what would be best for Mark first, and not only about what she wanted. She had admitted to herself sometime over the last 24 hours that she still loved Zach and wanted him, but that wasn't what was most important anymore. Anyway, Zach's voice brought her back to the present again. "I kind of fell apart after that. Not literally, but in a lot of ways. I finished senior year and went on to college." "Where did you go?" Dani couldn't help but ask. When they were in school, they'd talked about going to Arizona State as well as University of Arizona, But he hadn't made a decision yet when she left, and her own plans had changed. She'd delayed going to school a couple years. U of A, I thought about ASU but was afraid I'd run into you there. I couldn't have handled that. Not then. He gazed out across the lake but his eyes were unfocused, as if he wasn't seeing what was in front of them. I partied, I drank, I went wild. I almost flunked out the first year, then realized I was going to screw up the rest of my life. Not that that made me fly right, far from it, but I was more careful. I made sure I got my shit done and turned in, then I partied, picked up girls and slept around. He glanced her way before turning back toward the lake. I'm not telling you all this to make you feel bad or upset you. I just want you to understand. Understand what? You were it for me. He sighed. Once I lost you, I didn't see the point in trying to find anyone else or have another serious relationship. Not for a while. Not ever. Dani turned to stare at Zach. Surely you've had relationships since? She let the question hang in the space between them. I've dated some women for a few months at a time, but I've never been serious about anyone since. Not in 10 years? No. She blinked, not sure what to say. It was true that she'd only been on a few dates since they'd split, but the circumstances were different. She had Mark to worry about. She'd spent the last 10 years focused on raising her son, doing her best to take care of him. Zach didn't have the same commitments she did, to keep him from making the most of his single life, or finding someone to share his life with. So you were sleeping with Marcy? That was part of what confused her. It was easy, Zach said with a shrug. We both had a need. A physical itch that needed scratching. That was all. Dani turned to look out across the water, not sure what to say yet. A loud high-pitched beeping made her frown. What was that noise? That's dinner. Zach stood, pulled the screeching timer from his pocket and shut it off. Stay here, I'll check on it and be out in a minute. Dani nodded but didn't say a word as he headed for the door, or even after the thump of the door closing sounded behind her. She stayed where she was. She didn't know what to think. That Zach had slept with Marcy made her heart ache. At the same time, she felt a little better knowing it had been nothing more than physical. She'd been too busy trying to get on her feet, earn her certification, and raise their son to date, or even have one-night stands. But could she hold it against him for living the life he'd had? Could she blame him for trying to survive the reality he knew? She wasn't sure. She didn't know how long he'd been gone, when the breeze picked up a little, and the rustle of wind through the trees was comfortingly familiar. She closed her eyes and listened to the slap of water against the dock, as she tried to come to terms with Zach's story. It was harder than she'd imagined when she first moved back to the lake. She'd thought if he was still around he'd surely be married by now, but she'd been wrong. Would it have been easier if he'd moved on? If he'd gotten over her and had found someone else? A knot settled in her stomach, and the ache in her chest became a sharp pain as she thought about the possibility. Dinner's almost ready, Zach's voice startled her. She'd been thinking, and had somehow missed the sound of the door opening, and him approaching. I can stay out here with you for a bit, or I can go inside and give you some time, it's up to you. Dani opened her eyes and found him standing nearby, a slight frown creasing his forehead. Give me a few minutes and I'll be in. It wasn't that she wanted to be alone, but she wasn't quite ready to go in and pretend nothing haunted her or bothered her. She needed a few minutes before she could put on a happy face for Mark. Zach looked unhappy and even more worried as he went back inside. Remembering her beer, she picked up the bottle and took a long pull. She took a deep breath and let it out in a rush, as she pushed her emotions back to deal with them later, when she didn't have to pretend everything was fine for Mark. Several minutes later she stood, taking the nearly empty beer bottle with her and went inside.